My name is Maria Bellalta. I'm Dean of the School of Landscape Architecture. The Boston Architectural College has been recognized with distinction for its leadership role in educating an extraordinary diverse student body to help bring about social equity through design. Through the designs of landscapes, interior architectures, historic preservation, design for human health, and so much more. I welcome all of you tonight to the fourth event in our Spring 2020 lecture series, Just Design. This lecture has been approved by the AIA for one HSW unit. Please write Beverly Verla if you're interested in receiving credit. Her email is right in the chat. Sierra Bainbridge is co-founding member of Mass Design Group. Sierra oversaw design and construction of Rwanda's Butaro Hospital. As a cross-disciplinary senior principal and managing director, architect, landscape architect, and educator, Sierra guides the landscape architecture department at Mass Design. She directs design and implementation of Mass's projects in the United States and Africa. By working deeply across disciplines to radically reshape the material supply chain, Sierra helps shift Mass's portfolio to approach carbon neutrality as close to project completion as possible. Sierra is also working on multiple campuses with Indigenous communities in North Dakota, Louisiana, and California, and has overseen the development of international design standards, such as the African Wildlife Foundation's guidelines for conservation and creation of healthcare guidelines for Rwanda. Prior to joining Mass, Sierra worked at James Corner Field Operations in the design and implementation of a section of the High Line in New York City. Sierra has taught graduate level studios at various universities, and from 2010 to 2012, she served as head of the architecture department at the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology in Rwanda. Sierra is near to us because she has also served as a Sasaki Distinguished Visiting Critic at the BAC, teaching a studio entitled Urukundu Potter's Village, Design as Social Justice for the Disenfranchised Community of Traditional Batwa Potters in Kigali, Rwanda. She has lectured widely and has taught option studios at Harvard GSD in 2020 and in 2021. Sierra earned her Bachelor of Arts in Art and Architecture History from Smith College and her Master of Landscape Architecture and of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Please give a warm welcome to Sierra Bainbridge as she presents her lecture tonight, Learning from Rwanda. Thank you. Thank you, Sierra.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction and the warm welcome. And I'm going to now share my screen and make sure that it does so properly. Let's see. No, come on, Control L. Okay, hello. Yes, my name is Sierra Bainbridge, and I'm going to try to share with you a little bit of our work. And I also wanted to, especially when I'm speaking with a group of students, I find that when I was a student, it was really helpful to kind of see and hear about how people get into the work. And so I'm going to start a little bit. And I think also, what we've learned to do and are continuing to learn to do is how we understand how our stories relate to the stories of the communities that we work with, and that it's sharing those that begins to make the connections that make our work possible. So I'm going to share a little bit of my story with you. And it starts out with just this idea that we finish our mother's stories and we begin our children's. And my mom lived in upstate New York when she had me, in this little teensy tiny town of Hunter's Land, which is about 45 minutes from Albany, but we really had maybe 5 cars that would go by our house each day. It was super, super rural. It took me 45 minutes to get to school on the school bus. I was the first one picked up and the last one dropped off. And after having me, a mother tends to need to find an income. And my mom had me quite young at 18. And Cobleskill, SUNY Cobleskill was a school nearby that was offering training in inspection of the new Interstate Highway 88 that was being built at that time to connect these rural areas, which they considered to be northern Appalachia, to Albany. And it was approved as part of the federal interstate system in 1956, and then authorized by New York State in 1968. I was born in 1973. And then interestingly, in 1978, there was an executive order signed by Jimmy Carter requiring that there be at least 3.6% women hired on all construction teams. No, sorry, 6.5%. But I think the really interesting thing is, I was looking into this as I was, kind of digging into this story, and today there are only 3.6. There's 6.5 were required on all federally funded construction projects. But today in our construction industry, we only have 3.5% women who are working there. And I would say that, I try to imagine what it was like to be the only woman on a construction site of hundreds of miles long, inspecting bridges, telling contractors that the paint was too thin or the asphalt was too cool, and having them send back entire loads of concrete if the slump test didn't work. And I can only imagine what that was like. But from, some of the research that I did, it's really no easier today. And in fact, the stories that we can hear of people working and women working at construction sites in particular are still, pretty brutal. And so I have great kind of empathy and feeling towards my mom for bringing me to site when I was little. This was what I saw when I visited her. And I got the opportunity to climb into a bulldozer and drive. I don't know if I actually was driving, probably not, but I felt that I was driving a bulldozer across this immense site, this kind of cut into the landscape, which was bringing this new infrastructure to people and serving this area. And I think that really embedded in me this idea that the world around us is malleable, that, we change it inevitably, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. But that is, part of our being humans on this earth. This is one of the bridges that she built, and in every bridge she put a Susan B. Anthony coin when it was finally poured. And I have to make a pilgrimage out to see if any of them are still existing. But she inspected 5 bridges during the time that I was growing up. This is her in her inspector's car with her light on top. And I don't think she had any idea that, 20 years later, 15 years later, I would be up on top of a bridge, the High Line, wearing an inspector's hat and doing construction administration and telling the contractor that the paint was too thin, or they had used the wrong sealant, or that they were building the furnishings in the wrong way. But that's where I ended up. And of course, it was such a different experience, obviously surrounded by, an amazing team at field operations, tons of women on this project. It was an all-female design team, and really learned, how do you work with contractors, and how do we combine our different experiences and expertises in a way that actually creates a really wonderful project. And that's what I learned on that project. I had someone who worked with me who I was like, how do you sit through these meetings so calmly? And she said, well, because I know everyone in the room is not as smart as I am. And that was not at all the approach that I took. For me, it was the opposite. Everyone in the room, in my mind, was a resource and knew how to do what they did better than I did. I don't know how to build these things. I know how to design them. And so really took that kind of respect for what everyone brings to the table when I was asked to move to Rwanda. This is just a kind of, keeping tabs on the people that over time kind of pushed me in this direction, the people that are still my mentors, and guided me actually in the end towards landscape. And just a few images of what this project looked like. I came on at about this stage when we were taking it apart and then putting it slowly back together. And it was at this moment that in the fall, actually, it opened in June of 2009. And I started work with Michael and Maura Rockcastle in 2008, kind of moonlighting at field operations. And I was asked by Maura, whose randomly fiance was childhood friends with Michael Murphy. And he said, isn't your fiance like a landscape architect or something? I think we really need your help. And so she knew that I liked to, that the kind of work that I had always worked on in school was along the lines of finding the projects that could serve the most. And so she thought I'd be interested. And so we started doing this work. And then we needed someone to come and actually build this thing that we designed, this Butaro hospital. And so I moved from New York to Rwanda and started work there. And that was kind of the opening up of a whole new way of working. This is Johann Galton, who is a Norwegian sociologist, and really put forth this idea of what is structural violence. He works towards peace and conflict studies, but understanding that this term, which he coined, really describes our social structures, economic, political, religious, and cultural, that keep individuals, groups, and societies from reaching their full potential, or harm people even by preventing them from accessing their basic needs. And so, the projects that I'm going to look at today are along the side of landscape, because I was asked to talk a little bit about environmental justice. And so these are all landscape projects that touch on that, starting with the hospital. But through this lens of not what physical violence, what structural violence looks like, but also what healing can look like, physical healing, cultural healing, and structural healing, as a method to solve for those instances of violence. And starting with physical healing, Paul Farmer also a kind of liberation, follower of liberation theology, had his own kind of understanding of what structural violence means in the health services and health system. And that it's, those systems, the large scale forces, racism, gender, and inequity, poverty, political violence, war, determine who falls ill and who has access to care. And he called these the social determinants of disease. And he and Agnes Benengwaho, among others, including, President Paul Kagame, were part of the team that was asked to build a hospital in Rwanda, in the northernmost region of Rwanda, called Burera, in the town of Butaro, which had 400. It was one of the last districts that did not yet have a district hospital following the genocide. There were 4,000 people who had access to 0 doctors. It was a day's walk and often even a ride across the Great Lake Burera to get to a doctor. So if had anything urgent was happening, you were put in great peril just to access healthcare. And this is the site. It was the former site of a military barracks during the genocide. And so in itself kind of represents this transition, this moving from violence to healing by the kind of placement of the hospital in that location. And so again, I was part of the design of the landscape of this. Paul Farmer himself, who we lost recently, and I think for both Michael and I, was such a huge influence in our work. And I barely, I don't think I've ever given a lecture without talking about what we've learned from Partners in Health in terms of how we work, and especially Paul Farmer. And he himself loved plants. He was used to frustrate all the architects, the doctors, everyone else trying to get this hospital together by showing up on site and really just wanting to talk about how many water features there were, what the plant list was, and how things were coming along. And if there weren't enough water features, he would get one built. He showed up one day at around noon and there wasn't one planned for the center of the campus. There were 3 others, but they were a bit hidden away. And so by the end of the day, he had managed to have 25 Rwandans singing, moving a 2-ton boulder into place, putting in the electricity for a small pump. And then by the end of the day, there was the sound of dripping water in the center of the campus, and continues to be a favorite spot. What we were kind of tasked by him, and as well by Agnes Benengwaho, was to keep in mind the transmission of airborne disease, which, based mostly on the studies around tuberculosis, but as we know now, there are many, many diseases that are passed through atomized germs and exhalation. And so this was really designed around the knowledge and studies from how that happens with tuberculosis in particular, and also like really understanding the climate, and what can we do in these spaces to take advantage of that. And so you can see here that all the moves that we made that were really landscape based were moving all of the circulation to the exterior. Typically, if you go to any hospital in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a double hung, in actually most developing countries, you have a double hung corridor running down the middle of the building with doors off on each side, which go either to wards or to consult rooms or to offices. And oftentimes people are waiting in those long hallways. And that is a source of disease transmission. They're not ventilated. There's not enough space for people. And again, we know all of that in a much more intimate way, since we've all now experienced this pandemic. But these were the things that we were responding to in the design of this hospital. So all of the waiting areas are outside. Even the hallway where you have consultation is open air, and air moves all the way through from one side to the other. The only rooms that are closed and mechanically ventilated are those that are required to be so, such as the ORs and the pharmacy. Even the neonatal intensive care unit and all of the wards had a system of louvers that were inoperable, which you can see here on the top levels, as well as large fans and other air treatment systems, such as UV lights. And so that was really what guided and kind of joined the landscape and the architecture together through this design. But the things that we learned from Partners in Health were not just about how we should and learned from doctors and the health system and how it is structured in each and every place that we work, but also how do you engage the community in the process of construction? And so how do you take every dollar that's coming into a project and disseminate it into the community as directly as possible? And so, not only did we hand excavate most of the site rather than using a large bulldozer, initially we had one scheduled to come to site. It broke down. And instead of waiting for that to arrive, we said, why not just excavate by hand? And in so doing, we were able to employ 1,000 people rather than just a few who would be operating that bulldozer. In addition, we learned from Partners in Health methods of creating contracts that created expectations around the hiring of at least 50% women on site for unskilled labor, and that subconsultants be hired from at least 50% female-owned businesses. And so we kind of began to get used to and understood how to create projects that created this massive impact in their construction. This is the image of the excavations. And then in addition, training on every site at Partners in Health. They make their own furnishing for the buildings. They create their own gardens around, whether they're renovating or building anew. And they also train in carpentry, in furniture design, and building, in this case, masonry. And so we were using the local volcanic stone, which is considered a nuisance in the farming fields of Rwanda. And not usually used for construction because it's not structural, and it's kind of ubiquitous and so undervalued. And so we thought if we could change the kind of image of this thing, then it would be a new building material, inexpensive, available, and just by changing perceptions of it might make it something that's more viable for people to use to build homes. And since then we have had a woman in particular who started off actually on the landscape team, Anne Marie, who went on to start a women's masonry cooperative where she trained a number of masons, and they've been now building homes in their area, paying student school fees, and just creating, an entire economy around just the use of this volcanic stone. This is the stone that I mentioned that was hauled into place. There's a tube that was kind of placed in the cement here, and then it drips down into a pool there. And this is the middle of campus. The tree itself also really symbolic. And so again, everything that we learned from that project, I'm not going to go through now a little bit of some of the tools that we made are kind of became part of our DNA. And so we talk often that our first, largest, and longest running project is the design of our practice. And so all the people that we work with, these kind of great thought leaders, influence the way that we work. And so I'm going to run through a little bit about how working with Partners in Health influenced how we thought about design and architecture. The idea that, we're mission driven and that each project has a mission and that needs to be simple, legible, and transmissible, something that's easy to understand and talk about. That immersion in context is how we are able to kind of build consensus with the communities that we're working with and the people that are around the table, so that we can use our design tools to help people visualize the thing that they are asking for and talking about. And through those visualizations and conversations, we start to kind of create a singular vision for that place, where before, as we come to the table, often everyone has a little bit of a different idea of what that looks like. And it's through that process of immersion and learning what's possible and sharing the kind of hopes and aspirations for the project, we begin to start having a vision that is shared amongst us. Proof of impact, obviously, as I talked about before, it's, where are the ways that we can have impact, and how do we seek them out? How do we learn what those toggles are in each project? And they're different for each. Investing in upstream, meaning, I don't know that I can say the exact percentage, but our percentage of projects that we get through the typical process, which would be the RFP process, where say a university decides they need a new master plan and they post it somewhere, and then all the landscape architects go and they submit all of their experience, and then they choose one of them. That's a process that is based on an institution, a community, or a client that has been thinking about what it is that they need, and either has done these things before. They've managed these very large campuses or building projects or capital investments, and also know how to kind of like work in that system. And oftentimes we're working with and finding thought leaders and communities that can benefit from design, but haven't necessarily done it before. And so part of what we do is working to help people understand how the process works and where are we with each group in that process. And finally, that justice is beauty, and obviously the name of our monograph that came out last year. But the idea that, we all have a fundamental right to a beautiful and sorry, I'm looking for that other word. I'm having a word blank. A beautiful but also reverent space in which to heal, learn, and perform any of the programs of the projects that we work on. Also, we learned through that project about locally fabricated construction, as I mentioned, and what are those, how do we kind of work and how do we do that? Hire locally, source regionally, invest in training, and uphold dignity. And again, this project we started in like 2008, learning about these things. Dignity, that's the word I was looking for. I don't know why it escaped me. And I have to say that, like these things are still the things that we go back to on every project, whether it's here or Bangladesh or in Rwanda. And I'll talk a little bit about Rika next. But I think these same things were a big driver, but really thinking about it in a totally new scale when it came to that project. And so again, we put all of that knowledge to work for Jeshkio Cholera Treatment Center, the Family Health Center. This is our first project in the United States, first healthcare project in the United States. Redemption Hospital, which is being built in Liberia currently. And then Samagic Health Science and Student Research Center, our newest hospital. And this is amongst, 20 projects that have been built to date, but really how, especially in the line of like learning through healthcare. And I would say that this is kind of encapsulates, the kind of coming together of these ideas around how design contributes to our partners who are working with this understanding of how to create access for healthcare, for education. And, this idea that design is never neutral when we're thinking about how it is, part of the systems of structural violence. It either heals or hurts. And our mission is to research, build, and advocate for a design that promotes justice and human dignity. And again, this is, what we learned from those early projects. And I think this idea that design heals is something that remains with us as well. And we're now 250 architects, landscape architects, engineers, builders, writers, filmmakers, researchers, and whoever else seems like the right expertise to add into the mix for a particular project, representing 20 countries around the globe, and projects being built in many of those. We have 4 offices currently, one in Kigali, our largest office still, largest and oldest office, Boston, Poughkeepsie, and Santa Fe. And then as well, we have outposts of people in other countries, especially since COVID, we're quite dispersed and slowly coming back to our offices. We've built over 30 projects in the last decade it was 12 countries with, what for us is like a massive amount of millions, knowing that our first project was a $4 million hospital in northern Rwanda. And so that was this idea of physical healing. What does it look like when we're thinking about the individual and healing and access to health at that scale? And then I'm going to share now the Rwanda Institute of Conservation Agriculture when we think about what structural healing might look like. Rwanda, as you can see here in this image from 1990 and then 2017 on the right, from, just pre-genocide on the left, all of that green represents intact ecology, and all has been turned to white and is either through transitioning over to urbanization or agriculture mainly. And so the amount of intact and functioning ecological systems is much reduced. And all of that is in order to kind of build out and feed the growing population, which is continuing to grow. And part of the founding of RICO was around this idea of what might food security look like? How do we prepare for food security, knowing that we have maximized the farmland available in Rwanda, and yet the population is going to double in the next 30 years. And so that was really the basis of this project. And it really means that really we have to figure out how the same amount of land can produce twice the amount of food. And part of our kind of understanding of that was through One Health, which I'll get to in a minute. But that human, animal, and ecological health are intertwined, and that we need agriculture, we need ecology in order to support our agriculture, that those two things go hand in hand. And if we deplete and slowly decimate our ecological systems, our agricultural systems no longer function. And some of that is loss of soils, loss of fertile soils, loss of pollinators and beneficials. Many of those aspects of that interrelationship between ecology and productive landscapes. And part of what we were dealing with on this site and throughout Rwanda is how agriculture has kind of decimated some of those ecologies through grazing, through erosion, and in this case, losing wetland productivity in this particular spot. And so here again is this idea of One Health. And so the idea was to bring the One Health campus and theory, which is really kind of piloted by the medical and veterinary disciplines around the prevention of zoonotic disease transmission. So also, again, really pertinent for this time and from this kind of hopefully nearing the end of a pandemic, but knowing that many of these are probably still in store for us because of the proximity of human existence, urbanization to our ecologies and where animals are living. And so this interrelationship has kind of only been heightened since we started this project. What we think about when we're thinking about it with regard to agriculture is again, how do we design a campus around zoonotic disease transmission prevention, which is a lot around biosafety and processes similar to hospitals of moving clean and dirty waste, clean passageways and dirty waste passageways. How are we moving food in and out, but also taking care of manure production, etc. Regenerative agriculture practices, harm no species approach, and really thinking about how sequestration becomes part of our equation. And so we dug deep into site analysis, and this is something that I know everybody learns a little bit about, but I think this is one of the cases where it really was so key in determining our approach to the project and understanding where we were going to site the project and what our approach to the landscape was going to be. How do we get highest and best use from this 1,400 hectares that were granted to this university? And in the end, we did a massive species assessment, ecological assessment of flora and fauna, and found amazing, some species that are only found elsewhere in the national parks in Rwanda. None of them are found outside, and yet they're found in this one location. And so that really began to be the first steps of how we organized the campus. So first of all, kind of convincing our architects and our team and our partners to not touch these areas, especially this intact savanna woodland, again, the only one that's outside of a national park, and the wetland kind of riparian zone to the left here, and then the wetlands that occur all along the edge of the lake. One of the early conversations and with the architects was like, how do we nestle the buildings right up under these beautiful trees that are in this beautiful green zone? And we really worked hard to kind of say that if we want to kind of show the model of what future architecture needs to be, we have to be understand the value of the ecologies that persist and make sure that we're preserving them into the future. So we landed on zone 1, this area to the top here, the north slope, which was the area, probably most obvious to begin with, but there were a couple of other zones that had been cleared and, at the time were fertile, but due to some of the soil tests, understanding that those actually decrease in fertility really quickly in comparison to this north zone. And then this was also where the prior existing agricultural extension university was. We landed the 41 hectares of the university proper here in this upper area, but really also started thinking about what might other of those areas that are more disturbed. So understanding that zone 3 was some of the most disturbed area on site, and therefore primed to kind of expand and have grazing and other things that we wouldn't want to have encroaching on some of the more intact areas, and that also in future phases and as they expanded, especially pivot landscape irrigation, that those would be the areas. And then thinking also about possibilities of agroforestry and other services that could be offered. And so again, we were looking to intensify and kind of really concentrate the work into as small an area as possible. And so this was the kind of basic structure of the landscape. And then that analysis, as per that last drawing, really became the basis of design. The reason for the circles is that pivot, so this is sponsored by the Howard Buffett Foundation, working with the government of Rwanda, the Ministry of Agriculture, and eventually bringing on UNL, the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And Nebraska is known for its conservation agricultural approach, which is high level of soil conservation, high level of water conservation, not quite bridging into agroforestry and some of these a little bit more intensive systems, but they really wanted to bring their kind of, actually nationally and globally recognized ability to preserve water in agriculture through pivot irrigation in particular. And so that circular system became a little bit of the kind of method by which we indicated and started to outline areas. And partially because some of these will be pivot, 2 or 3 of these in the internal circles or pivot architecture, and then they will start to grow even further on phase 2. And so this is how the campus is laid out. It is, maybe if you took this picture from a drone at this point, it would look fairly similar, minus we finally convinced both our Rwandan partners and Howard Buffett to remove the beef enterprise. But this, just to kind of give an idea of how that idea of One Health, how we land that on a site can work through this early diagrams. I just kind of want to share the sequence that was created. And so of course this is shifted a bit and looks a bit different once it landed on site. But really the idea was that we have this smallholder farm in the residential and more private zone of the campus, where first year students, we also by the side proposed the entire curriculum for this project, because when they asked us to do the proposal, there was no academic partner on board. And from my perspective, it's really hard to design anything or create any proposals for an academic institution without a curriculum. So we designed the curriculum, which they ended up taking on almost whole scale. And part of that was this idea that the first year is really about understanding the experience of the Rwandan farmer. And so many of these people, and part of the idea of the campus was about capturing the smartest and most amazing students of the Rwandan academic system, who typically might not choose agriculture as a future, might go into engineering, might go into architecture, might go into medicine, but aren't necessarily thinking about agriculture as a kind of career for some of the most innovative young people. And so part of the campus was about shifting that perception through this place. And so again, so some of these students may not have come from a farming family and may not have the experience of what it's like to have a 2-hectare farm that you're running, both to sustain your family, but as well to create and bring food to market and create an income. And so the first year is really about experiencing that. How does each group of 7 students take 2 hectares and learn how to use them and create the highest level of productivity from that space. And then the other end of the campus is really about bigger systems, larger cooperative, mechanized systems, and they're much more public. It's about how we bring also not just these students, of which there are 80 each year, but also bringing through the agriculture outreach programs, thousands of farmers into this campus every year. And so this is how that started to lay out. We have the year 1 farms, faculty housing, and year 2-3 housing in the kind of far east of the campus. And then moving into the enterprises, which focus on tree and veg crops, poultry and swine, dairy, mechan irrigation, and row and forage. And then again, beef and cattle were removed, but we kept small ruminants. And then far over to the left is the agricultural outreach programs. And so the landscape then becomes the connective tissue between the farm zones, and they become like an arboretum and showcase of native plants, of all types of agricultural fruiting trees, an apiary, all of the kind of various elements that are the landscape part of farming in Rwanda. They can be test fields for testing. Say in Rwanda, there are only 2 or 3 types of potatoes grown, but when you want to expand that to decrease kind of vulnerability and risk, so that maybe only 2, if you plant multiple species and you have a failure, if you have more species planted, you have a higher likelihood of not losing all of your crop. And so being able to have tests like that within this area, so learning about which types of new potatoes might grow best here, and then connecting them through, this is the idea of Rfp Process. So each of these building corridors is bringing the raw material, whether it's dairy from dairy cattle or fruits and vegetables from row and forage, in through the outermost portions of the buildings, and then processing them as they enter the central spine part of the campus. And this is the central spine that then connects them. And then you can go along that central spine and, students are drinking from the dairy. There's a cafe with an amazing commercial kitchen where they're having some of Rwanda's amazing young chefs come and create recipes, and also where you showcase the kind of processed version of all of these inputs. And so again, that's what really was the diagram for the campus. There are other pieces that came into it, such as the ecological corridors that connect the savanna woodland and kind of upland areas down to the water. This is the first year farm and really looking at sun aspect. How do we arrange these things thoughtfully along a 30% slope? This is the Rwanda process system. So here we see on the bottom left, you can see coming from uphill, we have the cattle and milk parlors for our goats and dairies. And then on the bottom, we have the tree and veg. And so this is where you get kind of vegetables and field crops coming in, processed, canned, juiced, preserved in other ways to increase shelf life and market value. And then this is just a landscape transect really showing how all of those things not only produce the kind of content of the campus, but also fold into this One Health approach to balancing the needs of agriculture, ecology, and hopefully kind of creating new biodiversity that fulfills and sustains and expands on the species that are able to be present in this zone. I would say that, the other part of this project that became implicit was a kind of turning of our attention towards carbon. And, what we found as we started to get into this is that because of the way that we work, a lot of our projects are really low and below the global average for their typology. So they're very low embodied carbon because we're primarily already, because of our other learnings, using local labor, using local materials, resourcing local artisans. And so that automatically kind of cut down on some of the kind of heavy carbon pieces of the kind of cradle to gate carbon counting system. We have a couple outliers. We decided to do a green roof for some reason with a lot of concrete here. So we've learned from that. But in general, a lot of our projects are extremely low. And Alima Primary School here is probably the project we learned the most from, where 96% of our materials, because it was so hard to get to, came from within, I think, 2 kilometers of the site. And so we kind of took that and thought about what would that look like to scale up? What would that look like to grow your campus or to find and utilize the materials that are closest at hand? And so this, for a campus, a global academic campus with 41 hectares and 52 buildings, is 2/5 of the global average for embodied carbon for a university campus. And that is because most of our materials are excavated, harvested, and sourced in Rwanda. We worked with our engineering team there to source locally, sustainably grown. There has been a forestry system in Rwanda for over 100 years. But how do we make sure that that remains intact, that it continues to be replanted, and that what we're farming from there is actually structurally viable? And so within 1 mile, we got timber, soil, water, mostly from on site. Within 1 to 10 miles, stone, aggregate, and sand. We went into East Africa for more specialized things like steel, structural steel doors and windows, and cement. Rwanda is a landlocked country that doesn't have any of these resources. And then finally, even further afield for, sanitary ware, toilets, sinks, fixtures, etc. And then really withheld on global sourcing, except for those very specialized things like our solar grid, the batteries, the water treatment plant, and in some cases, some gypsum board and fasteners. Those are the only things that we got very far abroad. And so this project is also totally off grid with a big solar field. And then again, of course, 98% of our labor was sourced within 100 miles, which isn't true of all projects in Rwanda, where a lot of labor is imported either from Asia or neighboring countries. And so this is kind of the darker the picture, the more people came from that area. And then, of course, the over 85 cooperatives and artisans that we sourced for, all of the finishes. And so this is Willaris, a kind of extremely well-respected and working for many, many years in Rwanda. And these tiles on the left are from his studio, as well as our kind of weavings, furniture makers, upholsterers, which did all of we did all of the furnishing for all of the buildings on the campus, which is great. So we built a building with not very much carbon, but we actually have 1,400 hectares. So we have the opportunity to be carbon positive really, really quickly. And so part of that is about how we think about the landscape, conservation, restoration, and regeneration, which we've been talking about. And these are the 4 things that we apply to every project. And I think that these are valuable, whether you're looking at the scale of a front yard or a backyard, or you're looking at even a median in a street. First, you conserve intact landscapes, restore ecological function where you can, proliferate biodiversity, and sequester. And so again, it was about really retaining this remnant savanna forest and the papyrus wetland, using the site for highest and best use. And this is where we are today. And so this is the landscape being installed slowly over time. We also propagated over 250,000 plants on site that were collected from on site. So they're all local natives. This is Jessie actually worked on all of this, all of the planting, all of the design. A lot of this was straight from her brain. And this is the first planting that she and I did together, which was before the campus, actually, on a roundabout up top. And so it just gives a little bit of a view of what lots of the planting on the campus will end up looking like. And so the students arrived in 2019. There have been a lot of on and off campus bubbles, COVID bubbles, but they've been progressing and continuing to push students through. But really, I think we're always most excited when the partners and the programs start happening within the projects that we're creating. And so these are just a few images of what it's starting to look like now that it's becoming a kind of fully functioning campus. And then finally, I'll come to cultural healing, and I will be able to finish within the next 7 minutes, and wanted to talk last about this one project, but in particular, but I think reflects the work that we've been doing in memorials, which I think for us is one method of cultural healing that we've been engaged in. There are many, and a lot of these structural healings happen across, various systems. They're not distinct from each other. But the idea that, the world is a proliferation of symbols and that they're also never neutral and help or hurt us, and that memorials have the power to remind us of who we once were so that we understand who we are and also decide who we want to become. And then, we learned again so much from working with Brian Stevenson in this area of work. We'd done 2 or 3 memorial projects prior to this for the genocide memorial in Rwanda, the Holocaust memorial in the UK. But really working with Brian, understanding his contribution to thought leadership in making structural shifts. As a lawyer whose primary job is to get people off of death row and keep children out of prisons, he also understood the power of symbols, and really kind of wanted to make public this history of lynching that has been completely denied over the course of our history. I'm going to skip that one quickly. I wanted to get to this one, which is this proliferation of symbols, which he's referring to. And so part of the conversation early on was what might be a national memorial to lynching? Where should it be? Should it be in DC on the Mall? Or should it be somewhere else? Or should there be one in each state, which was one of the early ideas or the ways that he was thinking about it, to commemorate the lynchings from each of the 13 Confederate states. But this is the number of Confederate memorials in Montgomery, Alabama, where EJI is based. And, the only memorials to enslavement or the history of slavery were those that were erected by EJI over time. And there are 2 or 3 now. But this was his final choice, was to create this memorial in the South, in the place with one of the kind of deepest and most notorious histories of enslavement and treatment of our Black brothers and sisters throughout the South through Jim Crow and into today. And this was the outcome of working with him. And really, I think one of the other takeaways was his understanding that healing is a process, and this building is about the 5 stages of healing that he proposes and how those become turned into how they become spatialized, and that healing is not comfortable, that it requires discomfort, it requires proximity, a change of narrative, and it also requires hope. And those are 4 of the 5 stages. And so this is really about proximity, getting close, seeing the names, relating those to the places in which these lives were taken. The discomfort as you start to understand that they are actually suspended and lifting up above you. The kind of change of narrative. And this is a kind of gathering space where actually the first, during the opening, one of the first events there was a Sunday morning service with almost all of the leaders of the civil rights movement today, and those who are still engaged in this work today, came into this space. And then hope, remaining hopeful. And so that is kind of represented here by this ascent to this height in the middle, the possibility of actually being able to see out and over the top of this roof to the systems of authoritative, the regime that continues to oppress and was part of the Jim Crow system, because you can see the state courthouse, the federal courthouse, as well as the seat of state government. And then again, this idea of the twins, and that over time, this landscape as these are removed and housed and taken to sit in as an additional 700 plus markers to this history in the courthouse lawns of each of these counties. As they start to be removed, this space is transformed as those histories are owned by each of those counties. And so we learned so much of that. And then I'm going to finish with this Kendall School, which was about the story of Gerald B. Miller. And, you know, despite the fact that there are many, many, many African-American heritage sites throughout DC, what Kendall contributed through the process of desegregation of the deaf school within Gallaudet University is unknown. That history is not yet common knowledge. And one of the things that we started to talk about, and so the story there is that Louise B. Miller, there were 23 students who were admitted. They were in age from, I believe, like 9 all the way through 18 or 22. There were only 23 students. They didn't have a teacher. And, you know, there were kids with like teenagers with like young adults, and there was no productive teaching happening. And so in the end, Louise B. Miller took her son out and went to court and won her case for desegregation of the Kendall School and the taking of these students into the full campus in a desegregated way prior to Brown versus Board of Education. So it was one of the precursors to Brown versus Board of Education and really helped that second ruling. And so from a design perspective, the thing that we started to think about was this idea of abundance and deprivation. The right is the Kendall School, and the left is the rest of the campus, which is this kind of late 1800s Richardsonian, Victorian arts and crafts, heavy patterning, all of the things that contribute in texture and color to someone's experience if they're a deaf person, and their sensory intake is very visual and physical. And yet the campus and spaces that were provided to this community were the opposite. And so how do we think about deprivation and abundance when it comes to language, senses, community, culture, identity, freedom, memory, and love? And worked with the community and our core group there to think about what might it look like to create an abundant Black deaf centric space. And Gerald B. Miller was part of our core stakeholder group, as well as multiple, actually most of the kind of Black deaf leaders on the administration and in the faculty. And so a lot of the conversation is around learning, what is Black deaf space? Is it different than deaf space? Why is it different, and how is it different? When you sign in a Black deaf way, the signing takes up more room. So you need to leave more space for people between each other. There are a lot of aspects of this that we learned through the time, but also what would a commemoration for this be? What is the right way to remember this? Is it playful or hopeful or respectful? Where does it land in terms of an experience that commemorates this history in the right way? And so these are some of the goals that we found from a landscape perspective, and I think learned a lot from EJI. One of the things I learned is that Brian Stevenson's, in his mind, the best plant is a plastic plant in a pot that you don't really need to do much to. And so there was I think a lot of work that we didn't realize we needed to do to help him kind of see the landscape as part of the storytelling of the memorial, and having people have respite and shade in that experience was something that perhaps we didn't dig into enough. And so we really took that on as part of this process, is how do we understand? And I think culturally, like, what is the right landscape to surround that particular memorial? And so we really kind of took that on and had a lot of workshops around that, understanding what is familiar and what is comfortable to the people that we want to be there the most, and utilize it as a place of activation, as a place of healing, unity, but also the possibility for future movement and continuing to make change. And so in the end, we came up with this idea of this meandering path along which you have multiple histories of all of the people who are involved in this process and this specific legal battle. And then as you come to the top right, that is the memorial to Louise B. Miller and her son Gerald, and the 23 students who had this really I think Dana King is one of the sculptors of the art in that area, and I think reminds us on every call that we have with her that it was a really traumatic experience for these students in those early years before Louise B. Miller kind of brought their needs to be recognized by the Gallaudet community, but as well by the Supreme Court. And so this is the Freedom Garden, creating these spaces of kind of intimacy, of learning, of action that are both protected, but also spaces of communication. Everything is in a circle because in a deaf space, you always want to be able to see everyone else signing and speaking. But it's also abundant. It's kind of deep in, atmospheric kind of sensory intake. Like a huge variety of species, flowering throughout the year. And then we get to the memorial, which also continues that abundance, but kind of reverses it, and also remembers and commemorates the KSD2 footprint, which was the Kendall Memorial building footprint. And so that is a water feature where we also will see all the other schools that were impacted by this ruling, the deaf schools across the United States, but also create a space for the memorial on the bottom left, group work in the middle top, and then individual reflection in the bottom right. And so I have managed to finish just a few minutes late. And I just, I think, again, from the environmental justice perspective, ending on this note, that landscape is our most honest and unrelenting keeper of our mutual histories, whether logged in seasons, generations, or millennia. It doesn't exist in a post-truth world, and it is an undeniable material register. Without learning to read these embedded histories, they remain hidden in keeping sometimes revelatory and sometimes terrible secrets. If we begin to observe and uncover these histories, whether geologic, ecological, or human, we can use this record to hold ourselves accountable to our shared future. So this is a little bit, as we embark on 3 new landscape projects that are memorials, some of the way that we're starting to think about that today. Thank you so much. And I'm late, but I'm happy to stay for anybody who can and talk a little bit. Well, at least 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Sarah, very, very much. I think Karen had to dash off, but I know she was here up until 1 second ago.
Yeah.
And truly, that was a beautiful welcoming into your world and our world, really, talking about landscapes and ecologies, biodiversity, how to sequester what's happening with energy. And very importantly, the ending of your presentation talking about the value of landscapes culturally. So that is huge. And thank you very, very much. And I think we have maybe room for 1 or 2 super quick questions before these guys have to dip out.
I know you have to go to class, so I apologize. I tried to cut it short, but throw some questions in there. Raise your hand.
Yeah. Raise your hand. Or in the meantime, I know there was one question earlier while somebody else raises their hand, which is how much of the wetlands in the second project, I believe it was taken over to some of the built program.
None.
None.
So no, none. I mean, those were all actually either existing or will be restored over time. So along the area of the campus, those were untouched except for one place where we punctured kind of through that skirt or kind of banner of wetlands to put a dock out so that you could kind of get through and beyond and kind of see them from the other side. And in addition, the hope is that the university will work with their students and with the community to restore that whole other section of wetland, which is actually quite degraded from grazing, which is more of a seasonal wetland. But no, the idea was to kind of keep it as intact as possible and allow it to actually regenerate over time and bring back the edge of planting and farm use from the wetland side.
Thank you. Awesome. And I'm seeing some remarks here about Sarah, please come back and speak with us often. So we hope you do that. And thank you for enlightening us. Amazing work. And this has been amazing. And anybody have a question, Come on, seize the moment.
Let me just, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask, I missed the name. I think it was the second to last project. The first one you talked about with Brian Stevenson. What was the name of that project?
It's the Memorial to Peace and Justice.
Thank you.
In
Okay.
Montgomery, yep.
Yeah. Mahesh, please.
Yeah, Sierra, first of all, thank you so much for such an inspiring lecture. And I think it's going to stay definitely with me for a long time. I think I wanted to make a meta observation and ask a question about it, which is that to what extent is the business model of your practice a reason why your firm is able to have such an impact and choose such diverse set of projects and engage such far-reaching and extraordinary geographies as well?
You know, it's something we talk about every day because I think, you know, our goal, our systemic change within our discipline is to actually show that all architects can be in service of other than you know, private construction. But in order to kind of begin to, it takes extra time. It takes a lot of pieces and aspects and approach to design that isn't generally considered within the typical architectural services. And so to kind of create these models of, or proofs of concept, you know, projects that show how it can be done. By being a nonprofit, we are able to accept philanthropic funding that we can then kind of use to subsidize where we need to make sure that we're bringing those full set of services to these projects, which are, you know, sometimes we're, you know, working with organizations on organizational work, helping them to figure out, you know, is a capital project the thing that is needed. It also, you know, in some cases has allowed us to, you know, in the case of RICA, we were able to actually be the kind of arm which took the funding in, and then that allowed us to have like a huge amount of agency in terms of how we spent it, and paying and a different set of controls that you wouldn't have here because we were able to kind of pay the contractor, and then, you know, we were able to kind of argue for the efficiencies of actually doing as much locally as we did, because we knew so much about being there, and because we could actually kind of provide the unit price that would beat the importation price. But I do think, so it allows us to kind of be able to accept those types of fundings and donations. But I think what we're hoping to do is to more and more kind of function, you know, we'll always have a small arm that is philanthropic, but I think we're moving towards, you know, 60, 70, 80% paid market value, paid work, which I think ideally pushes us towards the idea that, you know, either every business can function as a nonprofit because we only need what we need. We don't need profit. We need what we need to survive. So, I mean, another piece of what we wanted to prove out was that we can provide in a nonprofit setting, you know, enough resources in the form of salary, benefits, security, longevity, that people can have a career in this, and that we can keep all of that knowledge that we gain through each and every project for the long run, and support people through having families and aging elders and all of those things. And but I think mainly we would like for the idea to be that that we as architects don't need to necessarily sequester like 5% of our income and say this is our pro bono work, but that all of our work can be serving a much, much larger segment of the, you know, built work that is happening across the world. You know, architects at the moment design 2% of built work, and how do we actually expand that in a way that's productive?
That's
so many
wonderful.
different answers.
And Sarah, if you don't mind, we do have one fun question here, which is, how do you consider, calculate, or balance the spatial demands of some of the projects that you design within communities that are expanding and developing. So,
Okay, wait, say that one more time.
so how do you consider or calculate the spatial demands or balance the spatial demands of the projects that you conceive and design against the kind of developing and expanding nature of the communities that you work with?
That's an interesting question, because every school that we've ever designed is over enrolled immediately, right? We tend to design for working with, I mean, a lot of that is working with our partners and understanding what historically has been their catchment if they're a healthcare facility, or their enrollment if they're a school. And I think what we've learned from many of our early projects is that those are all underestimates, because part of what design can do is inspire people to use the spaces, which they might not have been, been as apt to use before. One of the amazing things about Butaro was that, because instead of employing, say, 200 to 400 people throughout the entire period, we used rotating labor. So we hire 200 different people for unskilled labor every 2 weeks, which allowed us to employ 4,000 people over the course of the project. And the chances that somebody in that community was related to one of those people were quite high in the end. And the idea that, there was a totally different sense of ownership for everybody who worked on that project at the hospital than if they hadn't built it. When at certain point, partway through, when it was clear we were using really nice materials and it was kind of a new design, they came onto site and they said, "Who is this for? Is this a VIP hospital? What is this for?" And we kept trying to say, this is a regular district hospital. It's for you. And I think that's where, like one of, Paul Farmer's and, Michael talk about this false dichotomy that, that we either can provide the services or beauty, but we can't. We can provide both. And that, in fact, one underlines the other. If we provide a place that appears different, is well designed, functions better, is, dignified in the level of space that we're bringing beauty, then people perceive that space differently and tend to use it more. And so all that is to say that I don't think we've yet opened a building that isn't quite overutilized once we open it. So we've tried to adjust for that, but it's difficult because it also, the space utilization is not only related to what is expected, but also what is the budget and what can be afforded at that moment.
Thank you. And I'm going to put one more and then probably release everyone to go to class. Any books you might suggest or references?
I saw that one and I was like, oh no.
That's a broad question, but maybe a favorite one of yours or an author that relates to.
I mean, I'm going back to Paul Farmer right now. I mean, it's not design work, but mainly because I think it's part of just, processing, his loss, and which is close to so many of us at Mass, but, also that so many of his ideas apply to all of the work that we do, whether that we are all global health warriors, whether we're designers or doctors or other. And his work was not just about health. It was about justice and equity and equality and providing access for all. And that we shouldn't have different levels of opportunity based on our birth and where and in what country and the history of that place. So and his work is so related to that, and so much of what we do is from that I think Mountains Beyond Mountains is amazing. And I think I think there's a lot of design. There are a lot of design books out there that are great. But I think, especially through COVID, the thing that we've learned most recently is that we struggle when we aren't in proximity to the communities that we're serving. And we've been trying to do it over Zoom, but as we've started to be able to get back and start having meetings, engagement time with our partners and with the communities that we're working in, it's the thing that keeps us moving and going. And so I think some of those books, and Mountains Beyond Mountains in particular, helps us to kind of access that similar kind of feeling of proximity and why we're here and why we're doing the work and keeps us moving forward.
Thank you.